Iran's health ministry just updated its number for the fourth time this week, 50 dead. Meanwhile, the US military posted 2 of its own soldiers' deaths in a single sentence on social media, and almost nobody outside the Pentagon press corps even noticed. I want you to hold onto that gap for the next 20 minutes, okay? Because both of these numbers are real. Both of them are official. Neither one is a rumor, and neither one is propaganda invented from nothing. On Friday, July 17th, U.S. Central Command posted a short, direct statement confirming that 2 American service members had been killed in Jordan defending against Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks, with a third listed as missing in action. That's the first American combat death from Iranian fire since March. The very next day, Iran's health ministry gave reporters an updated cumulative figure, at least 50 people killed since this latest phase of fighting began in early July, a number CNN's live coverage repeated and updated across its ongoing blog throughout the day. Here's what I want you to notice. Iran's number showed up in headline after headline, repeated, contextualized, tied directly to Tehran's decision to suspend its commitments under the ceasefire agreement. America's number showed up once in a brief CENTCOM statement and largely disappeared from the news cycle within 24 hours. And this isn't the first time this exact pattern has happened in this war. Back in early July, US News and ABC both reported that the official American death toll had climbed to 14 service members, with more than 400 wounded, the majority suffering traumatic brain injuries. That story ran for exactly 1 day. So today, I'm not going to tell you one of these numbers is fake, because neither of them is. I'm going to walk through 3 competing explanations for why one number dominates the news cycle for days, while the other barely survives 24 hours, even though both are equally official, equally documented, and equally real. I'm going to use nothing but on-record CENTCOM statements, AP and ABC reporting, and Iran's own health ministry briefings. And then I'm going to show you why the real explanation isn't that anyone is hiding the American toll, it's that the 2 numbers are being generated and used by 2 completely different communication strategies. And understanding that difference tells you more about how modern wars are actually fought than either death toll does on its own. 3 theories, same war, only one framework explains all of it. Are you ready? Let's go. Before I get into the evidence, you need the 3 theories by name, because if you don't understand the categories, you can't judge the evidence properly, okay? Theory number 1 is what I'll call the simple scale theory. This says the coverage gap is just proportional. Iran's toll is larger, so it gets more coverage. Nothing more complicated than basic math. Theory number 2 is what I'll call the suppression theory. This says the American military and American media are deliberately downplaying U.S. casualties to protect public support for the war, an active, coordinated effort to keep the human cost quiet. And theory number 3, the one I'm going to build for you today, I call the 2 casualty economies. This says both tolls are fully real and fully documented, but they're being produced and circulated by 2 entirely different systems with 2 entirely different purposes. One designed to apply international pressure, one designed to satisfy a legal reporting requirement without becoming a political liability, and that structural difference, not concealment, explains almost the entire gap in attention. Let's take them one at a time. Theory 1, the simple scale theory. I want to be fair to this theory first, because on a purely numerical level, it has some real support. Here's the strongest version of the case. As of July 18th, Iran's health ministry reported at least 50 people killed since the latest phase of fighting resumed, with a separate cumulative count during the post-agreement collapse window, putting the figure at 38 killed, and more than 400 injured since talks resumed on June 22nd, including 3 women and 1 minor. Zoom out further, and the American casualty count sits meaningfully lower across the entire war. Roughly 13 to 14 confirmed U.S. service member deaths as of mid-July, plus the 2 additional deaths and 1 missing in action case confirmed on July 17th, putting the total somewhere around 16 to 17. If you're a news editor deciding how many minutes of airtime to allocate, a bigger number naturally generates more coverage than a smaller one. That's not a conspiracy, that's basic editorial judgment applied to 2 different sized numbers. And there's a real separate factor working here too. Civilian casualties, by nature, tend to draw more visceral public attention than military casualties, because civilians didn't volunteer for combat risk the way service members did. Iran's health ministry tally includes women and at least 1 minor specifically, details that understandably generate stronger emotional resonance and coverage than a CENTCOM statement about service members killed in an active combat zone doing the job they signed up to do. So if you're looking for a simple, unremarkable explanation, this one holds up reasonably well on the surface. Bigger numbers plus civilian details equal more sustained coverage. Nothing sinister required. But here's the problem. And this is the single most important question in this entire video, okay? So pay attention to this one. If this were purely about raw scale, why did the American death toll rising from 13 to 14, reported by both AP and ABC News on the same day, with an on-record CENTCOM spokesperson explicitly confirming the majority of the more than 400 wounded were suffering traumatic brain injuries, generate exactly one day of coverage, and then essentially vanish, while Iran's health ministry figures get folded into rolling, continuously updated live blog coverage that repeats and recontextualizes the number day after day? Think about that specific contrast. A rising death toll with a named on-record military spokesperson providing new medical detail about traumatic brain injuries is not a small or uninteresting story by any normal editorial standard. That's the kind of story that, in isolation, should generate real follow-up coverage. The fact that it didn't suggest something more specific is happening, then just bigger numbers get more attention. Theory 2, the suppression. Theory. This is the theory most people jump to immediately when they notice this gap, and I want to walk through why it's tempting before showing you why the actual evidence doesn't support it. The suspicion here is straightforward. If American casualties barely register in the news cycle while Iranian casualties dominate it, maybe the US military and American outlets are actively working to keep the human cost of this war quiet, protecting public support by minimizing coverage of the Americans actually dying in it. This isn't a baseless instinct. Governments throughout history genuinely have tried to control casualty reporting during unpopular wars, and the earlier congressional exchange we've covered before in this channel, Representative Garamendi calling this war a quagmire, and Defense Secretary Hegseth aggressively pushing back on that framing, shows there's already real political sensitivity around how this war's costs get discussed publicly. But here's where this theory runs into a wall of contradicting evidence. If the goal were genuine suppression, why does a detailed, named, continuously updated casualty tracker exist publicly, listing individual American service members killed in this war by name, rank, unit, and date of death, going all the way back to the war's opening days? Names like Chief Warrant Officer Robert Marzan and Sergeant First Class Nicole Amour, killed March 1st at the port of Shuaiba in Kuwait, are part of the actual public record, not hidden anywhere. CENTCOM itself, through Captain Tim Hawkins, has gone on record multiple times providing updated wounded and killed figures, including the specific detail about traumatic brain injuries making up the majority of wounded troops. A military engaged in genuine, deliberate suppression doesn't proactively release medical specifics like that to reporters, and it doesn't allow a public named casualty list to exist and remain accessible throughout the entire conflict. So the suppression theory doesn't survive contact with the actual public record. The information isn't hidden, it's disclosed consistently through official channels. What's different isn't the existence of the information, it's what happens to that information after it's released, and that's where the real explanation lives. The data, the actual casualty record, side by side. Now let me give you the granular side-by-side timeline, because theory without data is just storytelling, and this is where you can verify every number yourself. The war began February 28, 2026, with combined US-Israeli strikes on Iran. Within days on March 1st, Iran launched retaliatory strikes on American and Allied positions in Kuwait. That single event killed 7 American soldiers and wounded dozens more, according to the confirmed casualty tracking for that strike, and also cost 3 F-15E fighter jets to a friendly fire incident, destroyed 1 CH-47 Chinook helicopter, and killed 4 Kuwaiti service members while wounding 77 others. That same day, a separate Iranian strike on the United Arab Emirates killed 3 foreign workers, 1 Pakistani, 1 Nepali, 1 Bangladeshi national, and injured 58 others. These are the earliest documented American and Allied deaths of the entire war, and they were reported, named, and tracked from the very beginning. By late April, roughly 40 days into the conflict, the cumulative American toll stood at 13 service members killed and 381 wounded, according to consolidated casualty tracking covering that period. Israel had suffered 23 deaths by the same point. Separately, 43 other countries were reported affected by the broader conflict in some capacity, with 23 of those nations sustaining at least some fatalities. The overall combined death toll across the entire war, including civilians on all sides, was already estimated at roughly 10,000 by that stage, a figure that puts both the American and Iranian military tolls into a much larger, grimmer context. Through May and June, the war moved through its ceasefire and renegotiation phase, the Memorandum of Understanding, the 60-day clock, the relative lull in major casualty events. Then, on July 1st, a U.S. Navy helicopter crashed in the Arabian Sea. The Navy initially described it as a non-hostile emergency landing, and 3 sailors aboard were rescued. But the pilot died, becoming the first American death added to the official war casualty count since roughly mid-June. By July 13th, that brought the total confirmed American military death toll to 14, with wounded troops climbing past 400, and CENTCOM's Captain Tim Hawkins, specifically noting the majority of those wounded, had suffered traumatic brain injuries, a detail that reflects the specific nature of blast and concussive combat injuries rather than more visually dramatic wound types. Meanwhile, on Iran's side of the ledger during that same general period, the country's health ministry, through spokesperson Hossein Kermanpour, began issuing what amounted to a running cumulative tally specifically covering the window since ceasefire talks resumed on June 22nd. That tally reached at least 38 killed and more than 400 injured by mid-July, explicitly broken down to include 3 women, and 1 minor among the dead, and 22 women among the wounded, granular demographic detail that gets repeated in coverage precisely because it personalizes the toll in a way a simple aggregate number does. Then came the most intense week of escalation. On the night of July 16th, and again on July 17th, the U.S. carried out its 6th and 7th consecutive nights of strikes on Iranian infrastructure, expanding targets to include 6 bridges in Hormozgan province, a railway junction at Bandar Abbas, an airport at Iranshar, and a maritime control tower at Chabahar, explicitly aimed at cutting Iran's main port from its overland routes to Tehran. Iranian state media reported 7 to 8 people killed and 20 injured in that specific round of strikes. On July 17th, CENTCOM posted its own statement confirming 2 U.S. service members killed in Jordan defending against Iranian ballistic missile and drone attacks, with a 3rd listed missing in action, and 4 additional troops medically evacuated to hospitals in Jordan before being discharged. By July 18th, Iran's health ministry reported an additional 12 people killed by U.S. strikes in the previous 24 hours alone, pushing the cumulative total for this specific phase of renewed fighting to at least 50, and Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister, Kazem Garibabadi, announced Tehran was suspending its commitments under the original ceasefire agreement in direct response to the renewed strikes. Look at that sequence side by side. Both tolls climbed in the same 48-hour window. Both were confirmed by official on-record sources, CENTCOM on the American side, the Health Ministry, and IRNA on the Iranian side. And yet, one of those 2 numbers became the headline anchoring a live news blog that updated continuously throughout the day, while the other appeared as a single social media post that most outlets mentioned once and then moved past. Theory 3. The 2 casualty economies. Now let me put it all together because this is where the real explanation lives, and it has nothing to do with either side revealing anything. Here's the core idea. Both of these numbers are being generated by systems built for completely different purposes, and that purpose shapes exactly how each number gets communicated to the public, independent of whether the underlying facts are transparent or not. Iran's health ministry casualty tally functions, deliberately and explicitly, as a diplomatic and legal instrument. Every time that ministry updates its cumulative figure, it's not simply performing public record keeping. It's actively building a documented justification for Tehran's own subsequent actions, in this specific case, suspending its commitments under the ceasefire agreement. Iran's deputy foreign minister didn't just announce the suspension in a vacuum. He announced it in direct, explicit response to the rising casualty figures the health ministry had just confirmed. That's a tally engineered to be repeated, updated, and referenced continuously because its entire function depends on being visible and cited, both to international audiences building pressure for a ceasefire and to Iran's own domestic audience justifying continued resistance. The American casualty count operates on a completely different logic. CENTCOM's disclosures follow what's essentially a routine, legally required reporting process, not a persuasion campaign. Each update, the March Kuwait strike, the July 1st helicopter crash, the July 17th Jordan attack, gets released as a factual statement through official channels, satisfying transparency obligations without being built structurally or rhetorically to generate sustained follow-up coverage. There's no equivalent. To Iran suspending an agreement specifically because of its own casualty figures, no moment where the American toll becomes the explicit, stated justification for a major policy shift announced in the same breath. The number exists, fully documented, fully public, but it's disclosed in a format engineered to satisfy accountability requirements quietly, not to build international pressure or justify an escalation. And this asymmetry compounds itself through ordinary media incentives on both sides. A live news blog covering an active war naturally gravitates toward whichever number is actively being used as a plot point in the unfolding story. And right now, that's Iran's toll, because it's the number directly driving the next diplomatic move, the suspension of ceasefire commitments. The American toll, disclosed through a brief, factual, non-escalatory statement, doesn't generate that same narrative momentum, not because editors are suppressing it, but because it isn't functioning as a lever in the ongoing story the way Iran's tally is. The named casualty list exists permanently publicly for anyone willing to look for it. It simply isn't being actively pushed back into the news cycle, the way Iran's cumulative figure is, because nobody currently has an institutional incentive to keep pushing it there. That's the two casualty economies. Neither number is fake, and neither is being hidden. But one number is being actively, deliberately recirculated as a tool of pressure and justification, while the other is being released, honestly and completely, into a system that has no equivalent incentive to keep it in front of you. The gap in attention isn't evidence of a cover-up. It's evidence of two entirely different reasons two governments have for talking about their own dead. And understanding that difference tells you far more about how this specific war is actually being fought and negotiated than either number does sitting alone. 3 things to watch for in the next 30 days. All right, we're almost at the end, and I want to give you 3 specific things to track, because this is how you test a theory like this. You make predictions and see if the evidence matches. Prediction number 1. Watch whether Iran's health ministry continues issuing frequent, updated cumulative casualty figures, specifically timed around major diplomatic decisions, like the MOU suspension we just covered. If the two casualty economies theory holds, expect Tehran's tallies to keep appearing directly alongside major policy announcements, rather than as neutral, standalone updates. Prediction number 2. Watch whether CENTCOM's American casualty disclosures continue following the same brief, factual, single-post pattern, versus becoming a more actively promoted, sustained talking point. If the American disclosure pattern stays purely procedural, even as the toll continues climbing, that's continued evidence this is a structural reporting difference, not a temporary anomaly. Prediction number 3. Watch how Congress engages with the American casualty figures going forward, specifically whether any members push for more sustained public attention on the wounded, particularly the traumatic brain injury cases CENTCOM has already acknowledged making up the majority of wounded troops. If that becomes a bigger story on its own terms, independent of Iran's casualty figures, it will tell you the information gap is closing, even without anything about the underlying disclosure system needing to change. Here's your homework, and I mean this seriously. I want you to go find the actual named casualty list for American service members killed in this war, the one with individual names, ranks, and dates going back to March 1st, and then go find the most recent CNN live blog covering Iran's health ministry tally. Read both side by side and ask yourself honestly whether the difference in how each one reads, one a running, continuously updated narrative, one a static, searchable record, tells you something about how each side wants its own losses discussed. If you find something that contradicts what I've laid out today, come argue with me in the comments. I mean that. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to look at the same casualty figures and ask a harder question than which side is lying about their dead. The question worth asking is this. When both governments are telling the truth about their own losses, but only one of them has built an active communication strategy around repeating that truth, who actually benefits them? From you assuming silence means concealment, instead of understanding it as a completely different and equally deliberate choice about how to talk about the human cost of this war. Sit with that question. Look at the timeline we covered today. The March 1st Kuwait strike, the April 13th death count, the July 1st helicopter crash, the July 17th Jordan attack, Iran's health ministry's rolling tally. And I think you'll start to notice something the headlines were never built to show you. I'll see you in the next one.